Above everything else, it showed exactly what kind of character this group has. You know, the toughness, the refusal to fold, the relentless mentality, and the ability to adjust when circumstances change. Welcome back to the Clark Update. Today's story has suddenly taken another surprising turn, and the latest developments are once again pulling WNBA fans into a conversation that seems to grow more intense by the hour. New accusations, emotional reactions, and unexpected decisions are creating even more questions around a situation that was already impossible to ignore. So what is actually happening here? Are we watching this controversy hit a genuine breaking point? And where could everything go from here? Stay with me through the end, because we're going through the biggest details, the newest reactions, and the developments that could completely reshape how people look at this story. With that said, there is no reason to drag this out any longer. So let's jump directly into the biggest story of the day. It's over. The entire operation is moving dangerously close to a complete, system-level implosion, while some of the very people responsible for protecting it appear determined to hand out matches while pouring fuel everywhere. At this stage, pretending this is simply about basketball is almost impossible. What we are watching is an increasingly open, hostile, and unmistakable conflict developing inside the WNBA itself, with Caitlin Clark positioned at the center of a league fighting against the very player who has become its biggest opportunity for growth, relevance, and financial transformation. And now that internal fight has produced what critics see as its first major public casualty, they did not literally force a coach to surrender her job, because that would have been much cleaner and far easier to explain. Instead, the backlash became so intense that an accomplished, recognizable head coach effectively withdrew from the public conversation, abandoning the online arena, the supporters, and even the possibility of answering questions about accountability, because the criticism coming from hundreds of thousands of newly invested fans became too overwhelming to simply ignore. This has become a five-alarm crisis. It is an extraordinary example of what happens when an institution loses control of its own narrative while the public watches the breakdown unfold in real time. The traditional sports commentators who have relationships, access, and financial incentives tied to the league continue offering explanations that many frustrated viewers no longer accept. They call it rookie treatment. They describe it with dismissive phrases about adjusting to professional basketball. They repeatedly insist that what viewers are seeing is simply the natural physicality of the league. But the people buying tickets, watching broadcasts, purchasing jerseys, and creating the unprecedented surge in attention are increasingly rejecting that explanation. To them, the difference between legitimate physical defense and excessive targeting has become far too obvious, and the anger that was once scattered across a few comment sections has now become impossible for the league to contain. The wall of silence that once protected everyone involved is beginning to crack under a wave of criticism. Connecticut Sun head coach Stephanie White suddenly found herself caught directly in that storm after her successful team faced the Indiana Fever. Connecticut was one of the strongest teams in the league, yet once again the game involving Clark became dominated by conversations about unnecessary physicality. Critics argue that teams have adopted a strangely predictable strategy against her. If they cannot outplay her with execution, they attempt to wear her down physically. If they cannot slow her down with ordinary defense, they bump her, hold her, knock her off balance, or deliver contact that goes well beyond what fans believe would be tolerated against other high-profile stars. What made this particular situation different was not simply another foul or another controversial possession. It was the reaction afterward. The backlash was massive. Clark's supporters, who represent a huge portion of the league's recent audience growth, unleashed a flood of anger across social media. After watching her absorb contact game after game, many fans finally decided they had seen enough. Screens everywhere filled with angry YouTube replies, Instagram comments, X posts, and direct criticism aimed at White and the Sun. Usernames were visible. Messages were blunt, shameful. This is not basketball. Protect your stars. Other comments were even harsher. Your team plays dirty and you should be embarrassed. Is this basketball or a coordinated attempt to hurt somebody? The league needs to investigate this. Another coach resentful of a young player who suddenly attracts more attention than everyone else. The criticism continued hour after hour as a huge online audience argued that the media, league leadership, referees, coaches, and established players were failing to acknowledge something ordinary viewers believed they could see with their own eyes. In the strongest versions of that criticism, fans claimed opponents were trying not merely to defend Clark but to intimidate her, dehumanize her, and eventually wear her down mentally and physically, even though she is arguably the individual most capable of expanding the league globally. Then came the moment that intensified everything. Stephanie White's account disappeared. To critics, that looked like retreat. They argued that when she was challenged by thousands of paying customers and could no longer control the response, she exited the conversation rather than defending what had happened. Of course, deleting or deactivating an account does not objectively prove wrongdoing, and it could easily be a personal decision in response to abusive online behavior. But among furious supporters, it immediately became symbolic of something far larger. They viewed it as evidence that the league's old explanations were no longer surviving contact with the public. This is why the controversy has grown beyond one coach logging off after receiving hostile messages. It has become a referendum on the WNBA's relationship with the very audience it desperately spent years trying to attract. A coach associated with one of the league's best teams found herself overwhelmed by criticism from a public that increasingly believes the product is being mishandled. That amounts to an enormous vote of no confidence from fans who are essentially telling the league that they do not accept what they are watching. They believe jealousy is part of the equation. They believe excessive contact is being normalized. And they are warning that if the league damages the superstar who brought them through the door, they will simply stop paying attention. The atmosphere has grown toxic on every side. Clark receives extraordinary hostility from some veteran players and fan communities, while coaches and players accused of targeting her receive torrents of personal abuse from Clark supporters. Instead of creating a healthier environment, the league has allowed an us-against-them culture to deepen until nearly every controversial foul becomes a broader cultural battle. Officials apparently believed they could manage that story with ordinary media narratives. They underestimated the emotional and financial investment millions of new fans have made in Clark's career. The result is that this has stopped feeling like a debate about a few whistles. It has evolved into a battle over who controls the future identity of the league, the established culture that existed before Clark arrived, or the enormous new audience that arrived because of her. Critics view the establishment as insecure, resentful, and willing to damage its own product rather than accept the scale of her influence. Visual, high-definition slow-motion footage of Chennedy Carter's controversial contact on Clark appears repeatedly. Then footage of another hard hip check involving Clark plays in slow motion. Bold red text appears across the screen. This isn't basketball, it's a targeted attack. Whether someone agrees with that wording or not, the emotional conclusion reached by frustrated viewers could not be clearer. They do not believe these are isolated basketball plays anymore. They see a pattern of physical intimidation that is being fueled by resentment from veteran players uncomfortable with the attention given to a young star, while league leadership appears unwilling or unable to address the perception. They see contact away from the ball. They see grabbing. They see shoves after whistles. They see hard collisions that seem unnecessary. They see Clark knocked down repeatedly and wonder why the standard appears different. And then they look at the officials. Fans have proposed every explanation imaginable. Some believe referees are incompetent. Others believe the league tolerates a more physical style. The most conspiratorial voices insist officials have been instructed to allow Clark to be treated differently. There is no verified evidence supporting claims of secret instructions, but the fact that so many fans are willing to entertain such theories demonstrates how severely trust has deteriorated. Every missed call becomes another receipt. Every hard foul becomes another example. Every emotional exchange becomes further confirmation to people who already believe the league has failed its biggest star. Coaches such as White become part of the criticism because fans believe their defensive game plans encourage opponents to make Clark uncomfortable physically. To those supporters, the strategy looks painfully simple. Punish her until she becomes frustrated, exhausted, or injured. And when backlash surrounding that approach exploded, White's retreat from social media was interpreted by critics as a defining moment. Again, stepping away from social media is not evidence of guilt, but perception matters, and among the people already convinced something is wrong, the timing became impossible to ignore. They took it as proof that insiders understood how bad the situation looked, but never expected millions of new supporters to hold them accountable. For years, the WNBA operated inside a much smaller ecosystem. The people within that ecosystem could largely control the conversation because the audience remained limited. That is no longer possible. The gates have opened. A massive new consumer base has arrived, and with it comes scrutiny on a scale the league has never experienced before. The financial consequences of mishandling that audience could be enormous. Visual, a dramatic split screen. On one side, a completely packed arena overflowing with fans wearing Clark jerseys during an Indiana Fever game. On the other, archival footage from earlier seasons showing quieter sections and noticeably more empty seats. That contrast is important because it explains why this debate is bigger than basketball. Only a short time ago, the WNBA remained heavily dependent on broader NBA support and struggled for the kind of mainstream relevance its advocates had wanted for years. Many games attracted relatively modest television audiences. Arenas frequently operated with significant empty seating. The league had loyal supporters, but it remained a specialized sports product compared with America's biggest professional leagues. Then Caitlin Clark arrived after becoming a national phenomenon in college basketball, and the economic effect was immediate. Ticket demand exploded. Fever games were moved into larger arenas. Television ratings surged. Merchandise sales soared. Her jersey became one of the biggest sellers connected to a draft pick, and the extraordinary attention surrounding her contributed to a new level of commercial leverage for women's basketball. Charter flights were implemented league-wide during a period when the enormous attention surrounding Clark was forcing the WNBA to confront logistical and security realities associated with rapid growth. No single player deserves credit for every improvement, but there is no serious argument that Clark's arrival did not dramatically expand the league's audience and accelerate its business momentum. She became an economic engine unlike anything the modern WNBA had previously experienced. Under ordinary business logic, an organization receiving that kind of generational boost would protect the source of it obsessively. A rational company would build marketing campaigns around that individual. Television partners would promote her relentlessly. Officials would be especially attentive to dangerous contact involving the player, attracting record audiences. The league would make it obvious that opponents are free to defend her hard, but are not free to cross the line into reckless behavior. Yet critics believe that the WNBA has often moved in the opposite direction. They watch veteran players deliver heavy contact, hear established stars speak dismissively about the attention Clark receives, and witness commentators minimizing incidents that would create national outrage in other sports. Rather than embracing a rising tide that could raise salaries, visibility, sponsorship opportunities, and long-term financial stability for everyone, critics argue that portions of the league have responded with resentment. It appears from that perspective like people poisoning the very well that is finally providing them water. And that is why the situation is compared to legendary mistakes sports organizations could have made in the past. Imagine the NBA during the 1980s, deciding Michael Jordan had become too famous, allowing opponents to brutalize him without consequence, and watching veteran players complain that he was receiving too much attention. Imagine leadership refusing to understand that the superstar was not stealing from the league, but expanding the size of the entire pie. The NBA became a global powerhouse in large part because it recognized the commercial value of transcendent personalities. It promoted stars. It protected offensive freedom. It sold rivalries without allowing those rivalries to destroy the people audiences purchase tickets to see. Critics fear the WNBA is approaching its own version of that crossroads and choosing resentment over opportunity. They believe some executives, coaches, and players would rather preserve an old hierarchy inside a smaller league than accept a new landscape in which Clark becomes the most recognizable figure. Meanwhile, the fans who now generate enormous amounts of revenue are watching every move. That is why mainstream sports coverage has become another target of the backlash. Supporters who distrust television commentators increasingly turn towards social media because they believe established outlets are reluctant to criticize league partners aggressively. Comments flash individually across the screen. One comes from Jayhawks Fan 88. Stephanie White deleting her account says everything. She coached the Fever before and understands what a generational star looks like. Now she's coaching a top team. People called out the way Clark was being defended, and she disappeared from the conversation. Another comment from Sarah P22 says the situation is not even subtle anymore, claiming veteran players fear being forgotten, and league leadership lacks the strength to confront them. Another from Real Talk Sports Guy warns that if NBA leadership and the WNBA do not resolve the growing hostility, the league risks destroying the enormous business opportunity sitting directly in front of it. You cannot advertise a superstar to bring millions of viewers into the product, and then allow the entire environment around that superstar to appear openly hostile without consequences. That becomes a public relations nightmare, a business problem, and eventually a consumer trust problem. This is the reality league leadership cannot simply wish away. You can ignore individual comments, but you cannot ignore a revolution in your audience. Stephanie White learned how quickly that audience can mobilize. Her departure from social media became, fairly or unfairly, a metaphor for a system that does not seem prepared for the scrutiny attached to its new visibility. The old answers are no longer satisfying people, the old explanations are not calming them, and every additional controversial moment makes the damage harder to reverse. Every cheap shot that goes unpunished, every resentful comment from a veteran, and every coaching strategy that looks designed to physically punish Clark weakens the fragile trust supporting this recent growth. Sponsors do not want endless controversy surrounding the product they finance. Parents deciding which athletes their children should admire do not want basketball becoming synonymous with personal grudges and dangerous plays. Casual viewers who were introduced to the WNBA because of Clark have no deep historical loyalty keeping them there. They can simply leave, and if millions of them leave feeling disgusted, persuading them to return could become extraordinarily difficult. The nightmare scenario is obvious. The league eventually ends up smaller, less relevant, and financially weaker than it was before Clark arrived, while the people responsible are remembered as the generation that drove away the biggest growth opportunity women's professional basketball had ever received. That is why angry critics describe what is happening as a slow-motion act of institutional self-destruction. They believe everyone can see the disaster forming, yet nobody with authority is willing to make the changes necessary to prevent it. What would the alternative look like? Competent league management, business-minded leadership, marketing professionals who understand superstar economics, referees given clear direction that legitimate physical defense is acceptable while reckless contact is not. Look at how the NFL handles quarterbacks. The league has repeatedly changed rules to reduce dangerous hits against its most valuable and vulnerable offensive stars. Look at how the NBA changed over decades. Rule interpretations evolved partly because audiences wanted to watch elite offensive players demonstrate elite skill rather than get mugged every possession. Fans purchased tickets to watch Michael Jordan score, create, compete, and perform, not to watch opponents eliminate his talent through unchecked violence. Successful sports businesses understand that entertainment value and player safety are connected. Critics believe the WNBA has resisted learning that lesson quickly enough. Instead, they see chaos, bitterness, mixed officiating standards, and leadership that responds only after controversies become impossible to control. The Stephanie White situation therefore functions like a warning signal. It is one of the clearest examples yet that public pressure from this gigantic new audience can overwhelm people who were previously accustomed to operating within a smaller sports ecosystem. Nobody can pretend the scrutiny is going away. Fans are recording everything. Every hard foul is clipped within seconds. Every interview statement is archived. Every social media post is screenshotted. Every contradiction is cataloged. The evidence used in online arguments is endless, and that means the WNBA is facing a final opportunity to decide what kind of league it wants to become. It can protect competitive basketball while clearly punishing reckless conduct. It can create consistent officiating standards. It can communicate expectations publicly. It can encourage rivalries without normalizing hatred. Or it can continue allowing controversy to define the conversation until the growth disappears. Meaningful reform would have to come from the top. Dangerous plays need consistent consequences regardless of who commits them. Ejections, suspensions, and fines must be applied based on conduct rather than popularity. Officials must be evaluated when obvious calls are missed. Coaches and players need an unmistakable message that aggressive basketball is welcome, but attempts to injure opponents are not. Clark does not require special rules preventing opponents from defending her. She requires the same meaningful protection any league should provide to every player when contact becomes reckless. And because she is simultaneously the league's largest commercial attraction, leadership also has a business responsibility to understand what losing her through repeated injury or frustration could mean. Anything less creates an unnecessary war with the audience responsible for much of the league's newest growth. So I want to ask you directly, when you watch these games, what are you seeing? Are you seeing ordinary hard-nosed professional defense and fans overreacting because Clark is extremely popular? Or are you seeing a recurring pattern of physical and psychological intimidation that officials and league leadership have allowed to go too far? When a coach shuts down a social media account after enormous backlash, do you consider that simple self-care in response to toxic harassment? Or do you interpret it as someone recognizing that defending the situation publicly has become impossible? Those are the battle lines now. Traditional media coverage has not convinced one side. League statements have not settled the argument. Fans are documenting everything themselves, and their influence has never been larger. The future of this league depends heavily on keeping the millions of people who have suddenly decided to care about women's professional basketball. That makes your voice more valuable than ever. So tell me in the comments right now, do you believe the WNBA should fully embrace Caitlin Clark as the centerpiece of its next era, while creating stronger protections against dangerous contact? Or do you think critics are exaggerating the conflict and unfairly attacking players, coaches, and officials for simply treating Clark like every other professional athlete? Because whichever interpretation you believe, one thing is undeniable. The entire sports world is watching how the WNBA handles the most important growth moment in its history, and what happens next could determine who ultimately wins this defining battle.